this afternoon. It's another lovely day before we get the brunt of the real winter. So thank you. My name is Ramona Candy. I'm the director of the Arts Council here at St. Joseph's University. We do 4 art exhibitions a year. We do chamber music, jazz. So please make sure you sign our guest list so we can let you know we're doing something else incredible. And speaking of incredible, welcome to this incredible show with these incredible artists and this incredible day. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura. And again, thank you for coming, and please help yourself to our treats. If you go during, please be careful and quiet. If you go after, it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Laura Horne. I am the co-founder of Tussle, which is an online platform for articles and reviews and collaborations. I was born in the UK and I grew up in a small town in Ontario, Canada, and I worked for Christopher Cutts Gallery in Toronto for 10 years as the co-director before moving to the US about 6 years ago. So I wanted to read a little bit from the curatorial statement that I wrote for the show. The exhibition is titled Sculptors Who Paint and Print, and it's featuring work by Abbyssinian Carto, Ralston and Harold Wortsman. And while organizing this exhibition, I was inspired by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's 1766 attempt to define the distinct functions of art forms. The premise that most art forms find their definition in their stillness and space as a constant. However, sculpture introduces a compelling dynamic where it encapsulates both stasis and motion, capturing a moment while subtly alluding to the passage of time. These 3 Brooklyn-based artists who primarily work in sculpture challenge the conventional boundaries between sculpture, painting, and printmaking. Is the definition of sculpture definitive, or is it inherently interplaying with the static confines of prints and painting? Abbyssinian Carto, originally from Guyana, eloquently weaves narrative enriched by his cultural influences and personal experiences. Ralston, graduated from Hartford Art School in Connecticut, delves into themes of identity, loss, and transformation, bringing forth her creative narratives through corrosion-based works on paper. And Harold Wortsman attended New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture, and his work brings to mind archaic cult objects that balance freedom and clarity, creating a harmonious dialogue between the ancient and the modern. We, of course, extend our gratitude to Ramona Candy, the director here, for her dedicated support. And I'll pass it over to you, Abby, for your intro. Before we do some questions.
My introduction of myself personally.
Yeah.
So I'm from Guyana, which is in South America. It originally was a British colony, and we are more part of the Caribbean than we are part of South America. There's Brazil, we touch borders with Brazil, Venezuela, and Suriname. It's a very small population, 86,000 square miles, with a population of 750,000. And mostly concentrated, 80% of the people are concentrated on the coast. So we have a beautiful, pristine jungle that's still intact. Now it's beginning, they've discovered oil offshore, and we're in trouble with that in terms of how much finance is coming in for the oil, but for going into the jungle and getting gold and stuff. They're African slaves, descendant of African slaves, and Guyana and Trinidad are unique in the Caribbean of having indentured labor from India to replace slaves. Large population, they're like 50% in Guyana and probably about the same in Trinidad. That has influenced my work. We're small on the coastal plain, so we're all gathered together like how we are in New York in a sense. So, and then there's native Amerindian people who live there in Guyana that are mostly in interior regions, not so much on the coast, but intermingle with Brazil and Venezuela. It's only Europeans coming to make boundaries and maps and stuff. But I'm very influenced by their work. They still keep up their traditional work. They're sort of modern, but they still keep their tribal things and their art and stuff. And some of my work reflects that. The Indian culture in terms of Hinduism and Muslim religions also influence in terms of how we have Portuguese, we have Chinese immigrants that are also there, and a small population of Europeans. So that's largely where my influence lays. I've been an artist all my life since I was small, but I also was trained in architecture in Guyana, so it also comes up in my work a lot in terms of how I see things and how I lay my work out. I migrated to the States about 25 years ago, and I go back and forth between the Caribbean and coming back here. So my influence also has been influenced by other artists, particularly here in New York area, but also traveling in the States. I like to think myself as a Renaissance person in terms of that, because I'm interested in everything, science and architecture, and biology and mathematics and religion and religious cultures and stuff like that. So they all play an integral part in how I see the world and how I see my art.
Abby, I just want to say we're kindred spirits, especially when you're talking about your interest and curiosity about everything, because I also share that same fascination with science, with math, with ecology. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's kind of a more beautiful connections that are even being uncovered right now in our introductions. So again, my name is Bonnie Ralston. I am, as Laura said, a sculptor primarily, but also a printmaker. I guess my origin story would be that I grew up in a very small town in Connecticut. I like to say, I worked on I worked on a farm when I was in high school. I was very fortunate to have a lot of woodlands around where I grew up. I used to play across the street. There was a culvert, for those of you who are familiar with that term, that was diverting water underneath the place where I was living. So I used to go and hang out there and pretend I was, discovering a new spring of life and water, and just have a lot of fun with that. So I was always out in the yard, kind of playing around. And then when I went through high school, I also had a real strong interest in ecology and environmental science. But I also, as Abby said, also an artist my whole life. And so it was a really tough choice for me when I went into college, what path I wanted to pursue. So I ended up kind of putting the science onto the side and pursued a fine art degree, specifically in graphic design. Right, so already there's that sort of connection between process and exploration. Looking for truths, if you want to say that, in terms of communicating ideas, and also finding my voice. So I worked as a graphic designer for, I would say, about 15 years. Really enjoyed that component of just communicating, again, ideas, but I was communicating someone else's idea. And meanwhile, I was putting so much energy into that design work that I had depleted any kind of creative reserves for my own work. So basically, I kind of as I put science on the shelf, I also put my own personal art on the shelf for a period of time. And it wasn't until 2009 that I had started to become disillusioned with my role in design, specifically what I was doing and what I was giving to the world. It felt like I was doing design for designers, things like kerning and typographic choice and paper selection. it means a lot to very few people. And I was just becoming more and more frustrated. So I ended up leaving the profession completely, attempted a through hike of the Appalachian Trail, which did not, I still have 493 miles to finish, but that time out in the Appalachians was a gift of time to myself to really think about who I am and what I want to do and how I want to contribute to the world. So coming back from that experience immersed in nature, I remembered I reconnected to that part of myself, the environmental science, and playing around my backyard when I was a little kid, and determined that that's what I want to do with the next part of my life is give back and help kids and families in New York City find their connection to nature. Because I also realized, coming here, I'm like, there's no nature in New York City, but we are nature. Everybody in here is nature. It's just a continuum. And so that was really something that drove me to pursue a career in environmental education, which I've now been doing for, oh goodness, I want to say over 10 years now. And with that kind of freeing up my mind from the design sense of things, I was slowly able to come back to myself as an artist. So I really see that career change as being pivotal in helping me reconnect to myself and have that energy, because it's left brain, right brain. That's happening, and so really, it's my art practice has really been an opportunity for me to come home to myself and to be able to merge both my interest and fascination with the natural world, with chemical processes, but also in the context of New York City too, because the place is an incredibly important influence. A lot of my work, actually most of the print work, all of the print work that I do, let me correct myself, is made through, it's a process of contact printing using pieces of discarded metal that I've collected on the street. So there is a connection to place, there's a connection to ecology and thinking about cycles. And I know I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit, so anyway, I will step back and turn the mic over to Harold. So. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Ramona Candy and St. Joseph's University. I'm Harold Wortsman. And thanks to Laura Horne for her wonderful curation of this exhibition. Rather than simply highlighting each individual artist, Laura created a conversation where the works talk to each other as well as to themselves. Every time I speak about art, as much as I like doing that, I think of Matisse's words that the first thing an artist must do is cut out their tongue. So all the pieces in this room speak for themselves and want you simply to look at them. That said, we're here to talk as well as to look. So I will talk a little. We're all three sculptors in clay. We also print and paint. We met in the clay studio run by Adrian Urich, where I fire my work and where both Abby and Bonnie have worked. A few words about myself. As a child, I played with clay, plastiline. All the fantasies of childhood were visited upon these plastiline beings, but it was pure play. I knew nothing of art. Then for several years I could not touch clay. Somehow before high school it came back, and I've been working in clay ever since. After studying sculpture at Brandeis University, I spent 2.5 years at the New York Studio School, where several friends who I've met then are here now, working with sculptor George Spaventa and painter George McNeil. My pursuit as an artist has always been, by default, that which remained when I could do nothing else. I'd always been interested in printmaking, and this show is fundamentally about our painting and printmaking. But I never thought I had anything that merited printing. I had dabbled in silkscreen, and I wanted 1 year to print a holiday card. Somehow I met printer Kathy Caraccio, who told me about Sheila Marvane, the late Sheila Marvane. So I went to Sheila's studio and showed her my design. She nodded and said, "Very nice. You have some time? Here's a screen, go play." Sheila, having grown weary of conventional silkscreen printing for Marion Goodman, you may know the name Marion Goodman, she died recently, she's a very famous gallerist. She began her career with pop art, creating multiples, and Sheila Marvane was her printer. Sheila had developed a silkscreen monotype technique. We ended up working together every week for the next 2 years. Through Sheila, I became a printmaker as well as a sculptor. My work is abstract rather than naturalistic, but it is rooted in and comes out of the real world and hopefully evokes it. A few words about technique. The prints that I made with Sheila were all drawn directly on silk and then printed using her wax-based monotype technique. Later, I worked with printers Sheila Goloborotko, and for the last 10 years with the great printer Kathy Caraccio. And almost all of the prints, except that one, have been made with Kathy. Kathy is a wonderful printmaker, and I know some of you have worked with her. All the prints in this exhibition are produced through hand-tooled aluminum intaglio. I use aluminum flashing that I buy in Home Depot in sheets. It's the stuff they use for roofing. Using stone, chisel, and knife, I cut and gouge the aluminum like a sculpture. The plates are then proofed and printed on a normal etching press. One of my main clay tools is a rock found on Monhegan Island, Maine. I also use stone carving tools to carve and hack into the clay after it is somewhat hardened, like you can see it in that piece, Many years ago, I discovered oxides as a source of color. Unlike glaze, which covers all, oxides are more like a tattoo or watercolor, revealing the surface below. The work is high-fired in a gas kiln. I use the wonderful gas kiln run by Adrian Urick at 3rd Avenue Clay in Brooklyn, which is where we all three met. I guess that's about it.
I have a question for the three of you, a general question going into the fact that you're all sculptors and then you're printing and painting. How does that relate to sculpture? Do you start with sculpture and does it move into printing and painting, or is it the other way around?
For me, it's the other way around. I started with painting first, and had done ceramics at art school, but not with any intensity. But I sort of came back to it after, partly influenced by architecture, because all my pieces I don't use a wheel to work on them. I usually do them out in slabs, roll them out in slabs, and cut and fit them together. So that came from my drawing, and in terms of how I use the colors on the ceramic, it's come from my painting. Even though the thing about ceramics is that you don't know how your pieces are going to come out until they come out of the kiln. Happy accidents happen at times, but sometimes they never work the way that you want them. So that's sort of the part of not having that control that I have. But the three-dimensionalness of it, again, is what really excites me in terms of seeing a building. Again, I see in the architecture, I see building, and it's what I'm trying to get at.
Excuse me. For me, actually, I mean, I had, I don't want to say dabbled, but I had, tried my hand at printmaking. I was in high school and in college, but really, for me, when I got fully back into myself as an artist, it was sculpture, slab-built sculpture. And how I actually found my way to printmaking is thanks to the pandemic. And that is because Adrian's studio had shut down because of the pandemic. As you know, we were all sequestered at home. And I had been working on a large scale sculpture inspired by amphipods. And part of that sculpture required some bristles. And I was joking with my dad the other day that like, I use art basically as my excuse to try out new techniques and to get new tools. So, but for this, I've been collecting street sweeper bristles. I don't know if you've seen those on the sidewalks, but if you haven't, you're going to see them now. And so I've been amassing this collection at home and trying to figure out, I needed a creative outlet. Obviously, so much was going on. And I had been noting, you know, when you walk down the sidewalk and you'll see maybe somebody had put a trash can out for a while and then they take it back in. There's a trace of that item still on the sidewalk in the form of the, you know, a half circle of the rust. And I thought, is there a way that I can start to incorporate that and just explore that avenue of mark making, you know, with these materials initially intended for incorporation to the sculpture. And so that was like the impetus for me to get back into working on paper. But then in that time since, I've started to experiment with three-dimensional prints. So, you know, using the techniques with the rust and the salt and in some cases rock sludge, you know, applying them to the paper, but then actually creating three-dimensional forms. So that again, you know, working with, you know, how I also in terms of like architectural kind of structuring of my ceramic work, the work that I'm doing on paper then kind of comes back to the ceramic. So it's becoming, you know, somewhat of an exchange between the two. So the forms that I was specifically referencing were a bunch of paper amphipods again that moved on air currents. So it's sort of a back and forth between the two.
For me, the same. It's more like that sculpture and printmaking are parallel waves, which in some ways explore the same thing. And I don't tend to work in a linear fashion, and there seem to be periods where I'm focusing more on sculpture, and then there are periods where I'm focusing more on printmaking.
Okay. I love that you brought up the aspect of color. One thing that I was noticing, especially with the prints, the colors are so much more vibrant, and I'm wondering if each of you look at color differently when you're printmaking or painting or doing your sculptural work. And you said it's with sculpture, it's a little bit more random with how it comes out, which I think is really interesting. But do you think of it differently when you're working on canvas with paint?
I do. I think because the colors are immediate, I can lay them out and see how, and if I don't like it, then I can take it away and start again. And again with the clay, with firing, you have to wait. You put it in the kiln, you have to wait 24 hours to see how it comes out. And you don't have the control, which is the bad part for me with architecture. You know, it's I control things and they want to put them in lines and put them in order and stuff. And I have difficulty doing it. The one thing with the dancing on the savannah one is I do the perforations, which I love. And I can control those holes that I put into the thing because they're part of architecture too, because I'm in the tropics and we use clay to make clay blocks for houses. And you can use them, want them to extend it into use it even to security, because you can do the whole outside wall they do it in Vietnam and stuff like that. The whole outside wall is perforation. And internally they put the rooms and stuff, and I've been fascinated with that, and more the perforation come up in my works, and I have control of that, and how they look, and how big they are, and how small, and what pattern I want to use in. And, the colors I don't as yet. I mean, the technique of ceramic, you never stop learning. You never stop quite learning. In the art, it reaches a point where you know every sort of things, but then you can apply different techniques and stuff and get interesting results. But the ceramic is much harder. It never quite works controlled in the way that you want it to be controlled.
There's so much that I want to build off of what you said, Abby, but I guess in talking about color, if you were to look at my ceramic work, I mean, there's some of it here, and the work on paper, the predominant color is brown, and that is because like Harold, I also really I use, in my ceramic work, I use oxides. Again, it's to reveal the surface as opposed to trying to make the clay be something other than it is, and to show the process and to show the process and sort of the marks over time that are made on the work. And interestingly, with the works on paper, there's also oxides there, right? It's through the process of rusting, the metal oxide from the steel is actually, the iron is transferred to the paper. So there is a connection between the ceramic work and the surface treatment and the works on paper. And in terms, like Abby, you were talking about the control, the element of control, and that's one of the things that I love about ceramics is you can plan and you don't know what's going to happen in the kiln because that clay remembers. It remembers how you picked it up. It remembers, did you smooth it on both sides? Did you lift it? Did it fall on the ground? Because all of these sort of hidden movements and hidden experiences, a trauma maybe that the clay has gone through. you won't really see it until it comes out of the kiln. And in terms of the works on paper, I approach it in a very similar way. I don't know what it's going to look like. I will set the parameters. I will say, for example, the pieces on black paper, I'm going to paint a 6-inch circle of salt water. I'm going to lay certain pieces on top of that. But then I don't know what it's going to look like. I might have a sense of what the color will be. But for me, once like you were talking about, developing that expertise in a certain technique, what happens for me is if I've gotten to that point where I can kind of figure out what's going to happen, I start to lose interest. So, because it's for me, it's like you said, you're always learning. And so like Harold said, I'll kind of bounce back and forth between sculpture and then the works on paper to give that time of reflection and then come back to see what lessons I've learned and can apply to the next thing. So kind of went above the conversation about color, but
No, and to build on that, what I guess what you've both been alluding to is John Cage's concept of chance. Mm-hmm. And there is that element in the work, especially in my own work, it's both the sculpture and the printmaking are two-step processes. The first, I work, whether it be in the clay or in the aluminum, it's purely spatial, not really thinking of color, just purely spatial and creating an equilibrium. And then there's the second level of improvisation, which is applying the color and applying the color in the printmaking process. And in both cases, it's a little bit like baking a pie, that you're always, as both Bonnie and Abby have mentioned, there is a certain element of surprise, and not always what you hoped for in the final result. And finally, what Laura's question about color specifically, printmaking has permitted me to explore color in a way that I'm very much involved with color in my sculpture, but as Bonnie said, I use oxides a lot, and that the colors are more muted. I'm trying to find less muted options, but whereas in printmaking, it's easier, and I just find that I adore color, and it reveals itself to me in a way that gives me pleasure.
Bonnie, I wanted to go back to you about your relationship with the oxidization on paper and how that relates to your environmental background and kind of the message that that provides.
I think that's a great question, and I think in terms of the environmental background, of course, there is the the concept of upcycling or recycling, right? But I think more in terms of the materials that I'm using, but I think more than that, something that happens a lot especially in environmental education, and when I don't know if you've ever been on a program, people often say, "What kind of tree is that?" or "What is that bird?" or what is that, right? Identifying and naming and labeling something. And what happens with that is if you name something that's a sweet gum, okay, great, move on, right? And there's no inquiry, there's no investigation, there's no, what does that information do for somebody? However, when you look closely and look at something with beginner's eyes and fresh eyes, what is that? What is the behavior? How is that animal moving around the tree? What are the colors? What are the field marks? How does it, what are the behaviors when it notices you being in its space? And it changes your relationship to that organism from being something that is alien and separate to something that is, we share connection, right? It's looking for food. It's startled when somebody walks up to it. And so the same thing for me is important when I'm using the work, and specifically using the things that I'm finding on the street, because we may overlook things. We may say, oh, there's a big debate right now about what do you call a plant that is something that has been introduced to an environment, but is actually shifting the ecology and forcing plants that have already been here out of the way. There's native versus invasive. There's a lot of questions around how do we name things and what do those names mean. So by using trash, discards, and taking them away from that label of being something that is a negative or something that is unwanted. I really, my hope is with this work that it helps people, kind of reconsider what's around us and things that we take for granted. Because with what's happening with the climate, we really need to be stepping back and questioning our assumptions about everything, and really just looking at everything with fresh eyes. So that's that. There you go. Yeah.
And Abby, I wanted to ask you specifically about the materials that you find and use, and kind of your meticulous nature of adding paint to them, your connection to the object, and why you choose this particular technique.
A lot coming from third world country, it's sometimes material is hard to get. It's not as easy as getting here, and so you're always looking for things that are around in the environment. Tree bark. How could you use it? Preserve it without deteriorating. If you can, it's peeled off a tree, or I have a friend that makes furniture from. There's rattan furniture, which people are familiar with here. It's a cane, but in the jungle there's a vine. Everything is trying to get light in the jungle. The trees are close together, and there's this particular vine that invades a tree and grows on it, and it hangs down like ropes. It's almost like what Tarzan would sling on if he was ever passing through there and stuff like that. And they're as thick as your thumb and thick as my wrist. And somehow she found a way in terms of where there's some men that go in and cut it down, and it's sustainable, because if you come back in 2 months' time, it's starting coming down again. And you can go different parts and it keeps repeating itself. And she puts it in a steam pipe, and then you can bend it with the steam on it, and put nails down and shape whatever shape you want and leave it and it cools and she makes. So there's a continuous use of recycling things, you know, like people throw in old fridge and here it gets thrown into the dump and somebody will take it, put it on its back, put coconuts in it and put ice in it. So if you come for coconut to buy fresh coconut, you cut out the top and it's cool. So you're constantly recycling things. For the seed pods, I was in Guyana lockdown for 10 months during the COVID, and you know, these grow all around the Caribbean. You can find it. It's called a flamboyant tree, and it's beautiful red and yellow flowers they grow on. And I've always wanted to do something with them, and suddenly a day came to me, and I started using the Aboriginal dot technique in terms of putting on it, and they were like magic wands. I thought, you know, I mean, you can shake them and the seeds rattle inside, and you have to catch them at the right time because nature has a way of dispersing its seeds in trees and stuff. So usually they reach a point when they're dry, they curve. They almost make curve away in the middle and split in half and throw the seeds out. So to try to catch them before they start actually breaking, and hope to preserve them. And I started painting on them, and I've been trained in textile design too here in the States. So part of my work with textile, the designing and textile comes up. Like if you have a surface, how do you put something on a pattern on it, and it repeats itself, and that's how I started doing that. And so each piece is always slightly different, even though the technique is the same. Mm-hmm. The patterns keep changing in different ways. Yeah.
And Harold, I have one last question for you, and it's about the patterns that you use. I'm curious whether there are patterns that you repeat similar to Abby's technique, or is it more random in your sculpture and reliefs in your printmaking?
I think it's not intentional. It's probably more intuitive in the sense that, like, musicians tend to have certain tropes that they sometimes repeat, not in an obvious way. And there are certain colors that I am drawn to. There are certain forms. But basically the way I work is that, whether it be in the prints or in the sculpture, that I work very much spatially, and that the finished result is a result of a sort of spatial exploration, almost like a dance in space. It's not like I start out by making forms. The forms sort of evolve. I mean, it sounds a little odd, but the forms evolve out of the, in each case, out of the exploration, out of the process, whether it be color or sculpture. And they seem to be repetitive in a good way. In other words, they reflect who I am, whether or not I want it. So.
That's great. Does anyone in the audience have any questions?
First, a comment. It's rare that I've been in an exhibit that's congenial spirits talking to each other. I find this the most pleasant experience to sit surrounded by these images, and they're really all kindred spirits. And I mean, I know it's my brother. I know. So I know I don't know either of you, the rest of your work, but it's beautiful to discover it, and they're really talking to each other. I have a question for Harold, but Abby, you brought it up as well. I've always had a sense in your prints that they are hidden sculptures, or that there's a sculpture of leaping out of the page. I don't know if that's a deliberate thing or not, probably not deliberate, But I was also the sense with your prints that you're going ass backwards into the material, and that the dimensions, the third dimension is hidden inside there, but they are virtually three-dimensional.
Well, thank you. Can't say it. And I think we are three. And we are all three. There's an element of kindred spirits. It's why we kind of know each other and like each other, and also I think why this works as such a good whole. In terms of, I don't quite know how to answer you. I just do what you do, and you try and make it as clear as possible. I know in all of my work, much of it starts with the kernel of an idea, an intent, and then often that's achieved and it's kind of boring, and then it's almost pretty, and then it has to be broken open, and you find yourself in unknown territory, which at times is terrifying, and at times makes me almost nauseous. But that's usually a sign that something interesting has happened. So I'm not sure if that's an answer.
It's a response.
Yeah.
So God said, if you know what you're doing, you're not doing anything.
Something that I thought of too, in the sense of space and how sculpture is three-dimensional in space, and then you have the flat two-dimensional surface. Is that something that you're thinking about while you're doing either of the mediums, or is it just something that kind of happens unrelated to the confines of a page or a canvas? Or
Should I answer?
Sure.
Well, I don't know about either of you, but for me, they're not that different. The space, the pictorial space and sculptural space, they're not that different. Of course they're different in the sense that the pictorial space is flat and the sculptural space is three-dimensional. But in both cases, you have to, it's almost as if space is felt rather than seen. And that they are not as different as people assume. They're just different kinds of space.
How do you guys feel about the space aspect and the different mediums?
I think of, in terms of the two-dimensional thing, when I was looking at the questions last night, I think of Escher. Everybody's familiar with Escher's work and stuff like that. That is astonishingly for two-dimensional thing where things leap out to you when we see it and come back and go. But again, in architecture, when you're doing an elevation of a building and you're showing it to a client and stuff like that, if it's a 10-story building or what, and you're showing them the front elevation, and you use the shadows. You look, a light comes from the left or it comes from the right. And under when the lintel or some projection, you create a dark shadow on it. And so when you look at the work, you can see, you have a sense of how this thing will look when it comes into the light and stuff, on that flat two-dimensional aspect of your work. So it's on the two-dimensional, it's sort of a little hard because you have to know where to, again, to put the shadows or even dots. I work with dots, so sometimes you create a lighter one to bring things forward or a darker one to make things recede or vice versa. And it's sort of knowing how to play with that and to what extent your skill is in terms of how you render it and stuff. So that always is a learning process, and you know the ground rules for it, but whether you capture it in the way that really makes it sort of leap out to you and stuff like that it's over and over again. You learn how to do it. You know, you have to.
I think, excuse me, for me, in terms of the space concerns between 3D and 2D, in more of a, I would just say, a technical space. On the paper, like I do, when I first started doing these prints, I was using a very, what do I want to say? A very diluted salt solution. So to catalyze the rust. So for example, the piece all the way to the right there, that was one of the first ones I had done. And while the rust has been transferred to the surface of the paper, it still is largely, if you were to look at the picture from the side, it would still look like a smooth sheet of paper. But pretty soon into the process, as I was experimenting and playing with different ratios of salt to water, a beautiful happy accident happened where after the water had evaporated, the salt crystals remained on the surface of the paper. And that's where I'm like, oh yeah, here's something else that we can explore. So then I really started to push that and think about the surface of the paper as a sculptural element, and continue to experiment with different vinegars and different hydrogen peroxide and iodine. Do not use pure iodine in a room that is closed with no windows. That stuff is not good to breathe in. But what I was able to do is to really pull out the crust of the rust as well. So all of these pieces, if you get up close to them, there is that push-pull between the background and the foreground, heightened by the sort of the textures of the work themselves. And then in terms of these pieces on the black paper, these are inspired by an image. It's called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field photograph. That was a NASA photograph. Until this year, it reigns supreme as the deepest photograph of space ever taken. And what I found really fascinating about that in terms of space, literally, but also conceptually, is that in that photograph you could see the birth of different stars and different galaxies, and everything was kind of this mishmash of trial and error is how I think about it. And so that relates again to the work here and the process and the act of becoming. But in terms of the reason why I chose to use black paper here was to allude to that depth and that space. But I do think, just in terms, there is a space to the pieces, even though they're two-dimensional. That was a very long-winded way of answering your question. But.
Does anybody else in the audience have any questions?
I have a question for Bonnie about your technique. I'm really interested in the materials that you use. For example, what kind of paper you use to support all of the whatever
The fluid and the
yeah, and then also too, you mentioned that you're exploring building things or working more so that there's more of a three-dimensional effect. Like if you could talk a little bit more about
sure,
the actual technique.
Thank you.
Sounds amazing.
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, I appreciate that. So the larger works on the wall here, those are with, I just use it's like cold pressed cotton, 100% cotton paper. I can't remember what the weight is. It's not super thick. But it actually, when I have these things set up, I have dog cages that people have in their homes. I went to the PetSmart a couple of years ago and picked up the tray for one of those giant, it was like the massive size dog cage for homes, and I use that. That's sort of the tray that I do all my work in. The reason why I'm sharing that with you is because it gets very messy and a lot of salt and rust and liquid everywhere. But in order to keep the paper flat while I'm working on it, I won't tape it down, but I pick up wood from the street too, and so planks that I find, I use those to create kind of a weight to hold the paper down. But eventually it does react with the humidity, and the paper will kind of move on its own, and that's fine. That's part of the work, right? I mean, it's the whole idea of working with the material. And in terms of the 2D to 3D, last summer, I had an installation at the Gowanus Dredger's Boathouse, and this was a site-specific installation, and I had wanted to make something that moved with the air currents that were coming off of the canal. Ceramic would not yet anyway. The ceramic work that I was doing was not appropriate for that space because it's a multi-use space, so they needed to be able to bring the boats in during the week. So I knew that had to be something that wouldn't break, but was also lightweight to be able to carry that air. So I took that technique of the rust and the salt, and then formed all these little creatures, and then put them into, so it was kind of, they were prints initially, then I formed that shape, and then put them into some plastic tubes from some framing material I had, lined with the bristles, and kind of like almost incubated them in a bucket full of the salt and the rust and the water, and they were able to hold their shape for a little bit. Beginning of the installation, they were nice and crispy, but this was in August, so by the end of the thing, now they were a little more droopy. But that was a great, sort of first step into me figuring out how to incorporate the printing technique into 3D structures, and kind of in the 3D world right now, again, with sculpture, with ceramic work, but I'm looking at building off of that idea and creating more kinetic work out of the sort of three-dimensional paper forms that also incorporate the printing, which materials of the printing give strength to the paper. So it's kind of all over the place.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I love that you all have a very special connection to objects that you're finding and using. And Harold, I wanted to ask you about the rock that you mentioned in your intro, and your connection to that rock and why you use it continuously.
I don't know. I since then I use other rocks, but this is one particular rock that I found on Monhegan Island, which is an island off the coast of Maine, and about over 20 years ago I was there with my now very ex-wife, but we were preparing for an exhibition, and I spent almost a month there. It's a wonderful place. It has been sort of an artist colony since the 19th century, and there may now be, but for the longest there was no electricity. There's no electricity on the island. And everything there's either gas or, but I just started using this rock, and ever since that's what I use. I use it in both clay to get texture, and like for instance on the lower print there, in the lighter colored area, those little sort of black spots here and there, it's using the rock to press into the metal. And often in the reliefs, when I'm like this piece, when I'm preparing the surface, I use the rock to make it a more active from a light point of view. Instead of just flat, it's okay, but I use the rock to activate it a little. Other than that, I just like this rock.
Does it have a name?
No, it doesn't. It's just big, and it's very, it doesn't have a name, but it is, you could kill someone with it, or you could it's a hammer, whatever.
And it holds a history for you.
Well, it does now, but also clearly I like the fact that it is such a basic, simple object, which essentially artists have been using since the cave days, not to be fetishistic about it. I mean, not to make an issue out of it. And I'm only talking this way because you're asking. I've never talked about the rock before. It's a useful, but like I adore tools, as I suspect we all do. And I have many, many different tools. And it's a good tool, it's a useful tool. That's it, it's just useful.
Does anyone else? Oh, yes.
I wanted to ask you, Harold, once you've got these shapes cut out of metal, do you reuse them? I mean, can you take the ink off and then re-ink them? Or?
Oh yeah,
They're
each of them, they start out as rectangular pieces of metal, and then they're not put together. None of the pieces are put together. They're all one plate, which has been, and sometimes I edition them. My brother is a writer, a wonderful writer, and some years ago we produced an artist's book together, using his prose poems and my etchings. And it was the same technique, and Kathy Caraccio printed it. I printed it with her. And using the same technique, I was able to get an edition of 30 numbered images. To do that, we had to get approximately 50 impressions from each plate. And because they all in fact go through the press only once. So the inking is the slow part. And in those two, the background is a sheet of mylar. So I'll roll out the ink on the mylar, and then I'll ink the plate on two different tables, and then place it, and then it goes once through the press. So the slow part is the inking part. And I use an oil viscosity technique, which is, anyone who's done printmaking, the first where you intaglio, where you put on ink and then remove it, but you leave a residue, and that has one oil viscosity. And then the second color is rolled over with a slightly different oil viscosity, and because of that, the colors sort of hover over each other, and you can get some good effects. But they are very much sculptures in their own right, plates. And I was actually talking with Laura. I would love one day to do an exhibition of the plates as well as the prints, because they are sculptures. I approach them purely spatially, and then there's the second level of improvisation where I apply color. So that one day, Laura, let's do it. One day would be a great exhibition.
Anybody else have any questions? No? Okay, well, thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoyed the show, and let us know if you have any questions later on. And thank you to Harold and Bonnie and Abby and Ramona.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.